During the following year, a made-for-TV film entitled The Stone Tape was released. This was originally meant to be an 8th episode of an anthology horror show called Dead of Night, but it was eventually broadcasted under its own name, with many of the crew members from the main show working on it. This single 7-episode series of original paranormal horror stories followed in the wake of popular shows like Mystery and Imagination and Late Night Horror, and seemed to be at the beginning of a new era of anthology horror, as well as a general golden age of the genre in my opinion. 1972 was the same year that the second short film of BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas was transmitted. Not to mention that several single series anthology horror shows were made and broadcasted over the 1970s, whether it be Supernatural or the soon to be discussed Beasts, the latter of which was created by Nigel Neal. Again, this show is another affected by the curse of the missing episodes. Counting it as an 8-episode series with the Stone Tape, the entire middle of the run is lost to time, but again, there is some strong stuff that can be viewed. The first of which is what was originally the premiere episode titled The Exorcism. Personally, I'm not one that gets scared much whenever I watch older horror productions, despite a few exceptions here and there. I just generally enjoy them as creepy entertainment. With that context, it is really saying something that this is the scariest thing I have probably ever watched. There is one particular sequence in this episode that could be argued as to if it goes on for too long, but that cannot even detract from how amazing of a production this is. Easily one of the best opening episodes to a series that I have ever seen. A Woman Sobbing was originally the end episode of Dead of Night, and it just makes me want to see the missing 4 episodes returned even more, although I do not know how likely that is, unfortunately. This is an extremely dynamic, fresh and enjoyable 50-minute slice of supernatural horror that is very creative, unique and distinct from the rest of what I'm talking about here today. This is quite a character-centric episode, with a lot of questions being brought up about them that makes you think as to if what is going on is actually the work of a ghost or something else. Overall, another brilliant work of paranormal television that I personally just love, I would have said. Not as good as The Exorcism, but this was definitely a solid way to end Dead of Night. Now, since this bit's mainly on Nigel Neal, a lot of people are probably wondering what my opinion on the legendary The Stone Tape is. And personally for me, I've got mixed feelings on this production. I would definitely say that this piece's overall execution with regards to the concept is amazing. It has a lot of incredible set pieces, acting and moments throughout that makes this a very enjoyable watch. Where the piece falls apart for me, however, is the actual character work, of which I'm not a fan of at all. Whenever I watched this for the second time overall at roughly the beginning of this year, to me there was pretty much nothing with regards to the characters. What I mean by that is that it felt like they were puppets for the plot and nothing really much more. There's no real motivational writing aspects for the figures in this, I would have said. No reasons really given as to why they are participating in the events, they just are. I know this is an unusual opinion, as to me this seems to be hailed as the next best thing Neil did next to Quatermass, but it's just simply pretty average for me. I can't completely discredit the Stone Tape as it has a lot of amazing ideas and moments within it, and I would still recommend giving it a watch as it is definitely worth one because of the overall experience that it delivers, but for me it just falls short in the character department. Not really bad, just average as I've said. However, as disappointing as the Stone Tape can be for me, it was followed by Beasts 4 years later, which is easily one of the finest television programs I have ever seen. This is basically a supernatural and bestial horror anthology miniseries that not only shows and displays why I love Nigel Neal and all of the different avenues of that adoration, but to top that off, it has what are now 2 of my absolute favourite bits of television. Say what you will about the second episode entitled Buddy Boy, which is typically hated from what little of the general consensus of this show that I know of. But for me, I personally enjoy it. It's a completely bizarre, wacky and off-the-wall piece from Neil that I find to be extremely enjoyable, despite it not really being what I'm looking for at all from a show of this type. Despite the minor snag that Buddy Boy is for this show, the rest of it is absolutely fantastic, with the other episodes either getting a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10 from me. Murrian, an episode he penned for the ATV anthology Against the Crowd in 1975, which effectively acts as a pilot for the main show, reminded me a lot of a previous effort by the creator, Hammer's films The Witches, as well as Doctor Who's The Daemons. A small town, scared locals, and a battle between superstition and science. For me, whenever it comes to paranormal stories, the unexplainable is something that is bound to come up whenever exploring those types of stories. And I feel that a lot of the media that encapsulates them mirrors this. An example being the first installment of the main 6-episode run, Baby. During house renovations, the partner of a pregnant woman finds this mysterious capsule within a wall, and she starts seeing weird things. Quite a simple story, nothing that really pushes the boundaries, but fantastically done. What she sees is never fully explained and why it was appearing, which may disappoint some people, but again it plays into that particular aspect of the paranormal, which is that it is very much full of inexplicability. Perhaps the best episode of Beasts comes at the halfway mark with The Dummy. Whereas this definitely wasn't the last good episode of the series, it was the most powerful for me with its overall message and almost transcendental nature. The installment opens up with a scene trying to be shot in a film studio for the latest in a long line of films featuring a monster simply known as The Dummy, and as the overall runtime progresses, things steadily get out of control with one of the most unique spins on horror that I have ever seen. I said that this was very much a display of all of the skills that Neil had as a writer for me, and this is probably the most exemplary for his sheer talent for characters. In fact, I will actually say that the actor character within Clyde Boyd is probably the best figure he ever created in my opinion, although the overall episode doesn't quite reach the heights of Quatermass and the Pit TV version for me though. You really are able to get into the mind of this character, what is bothering him, and to be able to connect with him. I will also say similar things with What Big Eyes, a very much character-driven exploration of lycanthropy, an episode that for me was interesting to have back to back with the amazing and truly scary finale during Barty's party, as the nature of how the overall story was framed pretty similarly. With What Big Eyes using the story of Little Red Riding Hood, of which the title is a quotation of, and the latter's title is the name given to a radio show featured within that is used to convey expository stuff needed for the overall story progression. For the one episode that I haven't mentioned yet, Special Offer, for me personally it was a little hard to take seriously in the initial opening minutes, but as it progressed, this was a very engaging story about a poltergeist in a supermarket, which in turn makes it kind of special for me, combining something that truly fascinates me and the same type of work that I'm employed with. Overall, Beasts is simply a masterclass in horror television in my opinion, and it's just simply one of the greatest TV programs I have ever seen. I think it could be safe to say that the following decade was pretty much the beginning of the end for Nigel Neal's career. From what I've heard, he was becoming more aware of the rising groups known as fan bases at the end of the 1970s, and in turn became willing to dislike the people that worshipped him. This all began back whenever what would be the last Quatermass TV story to be transmitted came out in 1979, which in turn led to reprintings of the script books of the original 1950s trilogy and a massive resurgence in popularity for the franchise in question. Apparently he used some aspects of the fan base at the time for comedic effect in what I think many will say is his most forgotten work, Kindvig. This was a 7-episode, 1981 sci-fi comedy series that ended up being the only sitcom he made. Considering that Nigel was known mainly for serious tales of science fiction and horror, I'm not surprised that this has been forgotten about pretty much, and it'll probably be the last of his work that I'll buy, to be honest. As if this oddity in the early 1980s wasn't strange enough for Neil, he had a rough time involving what is still one of the biggest horror movie franchises of all time. 1978 saw the release of one of the most iconic movies of that genre ever, Halloween by John Carpenter. Following an unsuccessful sequel with Halloween 2 in 1981, John was looking for a fresh approach with a third entry and started to work together with Nigel on it, with the latter writing it. What resulted from this was an anthology movie and the only Halloween one not to feature Michael Myers. Once the initial script was delivered, Carpenter thought there was adequate but needed work. This eventually snowballed into troubles with the film behind the scenes, with the resulting final product, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, being a heavily rewritten version of Nigel Neal's original script, whom had his name removed from the movie due to dissatisfaction with how the project was going. Despite how bumpy this decade was going so far, it somehow managed to end with what is essentially a final triumph of his career, the 1989 television movie adaptation of Susan Hill's The Woman in Black. Despite myself saying that it isn't quite perfect, as I do have a minor issue with it towards the end, looking at it critically, I will still agree that this is still another truly incredible addition to the Neil catalogue. The main character, Arthur Kidd, as played by Adrian Rawlins, is a solicitor and sent out to Criffin Gifford with the task of settling documents and paperwork for the estate of a reclusive widow that had recently passed away. As he explores the area and continues his assignment, strange paranormal goings-on happen, with him in turn finding that the town's residents are superstitious and paranoid about the paranormal, with almost nobody willing to step foot in the house, known as Eelmarsh, that he has to. I've mentioned how Nigel is absolutely brilliant with characters before and will do so again here. However, I do feel that is perhaps most important with this particular work by him. The main supernatural presence within the film is obviously the titular entity, however it isn't the only one that is showcased and featured within. This leads to two separate plot threads that eventually entangle and connect within. Saying that the Woman in Black is the A plot, B is very much hinged and connected to the main character, with it implying spiritual attachment to objects and how Arthur is very much a family person and one that loves children. The opening 8 or so minutes is very much the setup for the film, laying down the groundwork for the last 95 or so. Here, a lot of what Kidd is as a character is displayed and aptly shown, allowing us viewers to see that he is a family man, with him having a wife, a young son called Eddie, and an infant child. His connection and bond with the aforementioned Eddie is shown in quite a humorous moment within the first shown instance of how he brings home things from work for him, with this particular one being a kazoo. Since I want to try and stay away from spoilers, I don't particularly want to give a massive amount of detail as to this paranormal B plot, but it makes great use of the makeup of Arthur Kidd and intertwining him into two separate paranormal events not related to the title character. In fact, I would have said that some of the film's scariest moments come from this secondary plot line. I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about this particular iteration or not, but a story by Susan Hill would be adapted again in 2012 by Hammer Films with Daniel Radcliffe in the main role. I've seen a lot of people compare this to the 1989 version and say that Neil's version is/was a lot scarier than this modern iteration, and personally I would agree that the horror in this one is much more well crafted and better, the 1989 version that is. All of the scenes with the paranormal events are magnificently constructed. There's a total of 6 sightings of the Woman in Black, and how they are shown and presented are excellent, although I should mention that the 5th is implicatory and not visually. For fans, perhaps one of the most noteworthy, I would have said, is the 2nd in the graveyard after the funeral of the widow. In the scene, the camera isn't focusing on her specifically, but instead the human characters that are delivering the scene. Her appearance is very much treated like an object in the background from a visual standpoint. There's only about 7 shots in the entire movie in which we get to see the entity in detail actually, which is during the third sighting and was commonly referred to as quote unquote that scene. As with Quatermass and the Pit, Neil does also dabble in various outlets and bits of mythos to do with the paranormal. I mentioned earlier how the Arthur Kidd plot deals with spiritual attachment, but the production also dips its toes, not as exploratively, into the idea and concept of how animals can pick up on ghosts and things we cannot see. One of the secondary characters that we get introduced to is Sam Toovey, whom Arthur meets shortly after arriving in Clifton Gifford. About 40 minutes into the film is a dinner scene that Sam invited Kidd to, with a conversation between the two afterwards about what the latter has experienced so far in terms of the paranormal in and around the town and up at Eelmarsh House. Sam, listening to what the main character has to say and seeing him genuinely freaked out, says that Arthur cannot go back to the house alone and offers to let him take a Jack Russell dog named Spider with him. This in turn leads to some interesting and creepy scenes at the main location, involving the dog barking and snarling at things that Kidd cannot see, particularly one involving a locked door. Another big highlight of the piece is the overall atmosphere, which can in turn play into the realisation of the time period that the flick is set in. The general architecture shown, as well as the inclusion of at-the-time technology, like the wax cylinders home media format that Arthur finds in the house, blends together wonderfully, with occasional fog-laden landscapes and candle-lit rooms. Overall, this is a simply brilliant last bit of glory for Nigel Kneale's career in my opinion, and one that I would highly recommend. If we were to consider that the holy trinity of ghost stories by Nigel are Quatermass and the Pit, The Stone Tape and The Woman in Black, then it is an extremely varied and individualistic trilogy. The former very much tackles the conceptuality of the paranormal and what it actually means. The second, on the surface, is a fairly standard haunting building or house story, but takes an interesting look into what could be a cause and catalyst for ghosts, with the finale very much being a more traditional ghost story in the vein of the 1970s adaptive work of M.R. James's stories, not to mention that this was also broadcasted around Christmas time originally. The Woman in Black is simply a brilliant footnote-like appearance within the career of Nigel Kneale. It has some truly amazing and scary moments from within the horror genre, and is one that I simply cannot recommend enough.